The morning after her 52nd birthday, everything in Sarah Noble's world simply stopped. No forced entry, no goodbye note, no signs of a struggle, just absence. For 4 months, no one knew where she was. Then 3 women walking in the woods found something that shattered everyone's assumptions. But the discovery didn't solve the mystery. It made it even stranger. Because once investigators revealed what they found wrapped around her neck, the entire case began to collapse under its own contradictions. And by the end of this story, you'll see why so many people believe the truth still doesn't add up. Did Sarah take her own life, or did someone she trusted help stage it? How did trained investigators miss crucial evidence twice? And why did a jury reach a decision that shocked both the police and Sarah's family? To understand that, we need to go back. Because this story doesn't begin with a disappearance. It begins with a marriage full of secrets. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah Noble wasn't supposed to disappear. At 52 years old, she had survived more than most people could imagine. She had buried a daughter, endured the kind of grief that reshapes a person from the inside out, and somehow found the strength to keep moving forward. Those who knew her described a woman who carried her pain quietly, never letting it define her completely. She worked as a social worker in Columbus, Ohio, helping families navigate their darkest moments, perhaps because she understood darkness so intimately herself. Her colleagues remember her as dependable, empathetic, someone who showed up even when showing up was hard. She had routines that anchored her, small rituals that gave structure to days that might otherwise feel overwhelming. Morning coffee on the back porch, evening walks through their quiet neighborhood, weekend trips to the farmer's market, where she knew most of the vendors by name. These weren't just habits, they were lifelines, the kind of predictable patterns that help someone who's known instability find solid ground again. But beneath that carefully constructed stability, there were cracks that most people never saw. Sarah had struggled with depression for years, something she'd been open about with close friends and her therapist. It wasn't constant, but it came in waves. Periods where the weight of everything she'd lost would settle over her like fog. She'd been on medication, had done the work, had built coping strategies that mostly kept her afloat. But anyone who's lived with depression knows it's not something you defeat once and walk away from. It's something you manage, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. And, in the months leading up to her disappearance, some of those who knew her best noticed she seemed more withdrawn than usual. Not dramatically different, but quieter, a little more distant, like she was pulling back into herself in ways that felt familiar and concerning all at once. Her marriage to David Moore added another layer of complexity to her life. David was 54, a former firefighter who'd spent 20 years running into burning buildings before retiring on disability, after a back injury ended his career. He was the kind of man who valued discipline and routine, who kept his emotions close and his circle small. Friends described him as reserved, dependable in his own way, but not particularly warm or expressive. He and Sarah had married 5 years earlier, both of them bringing their own histories of loss and trauma into the relationship. David had his own struggles with the transition from active firefighter to civilian life, the kind of identity shift that can leave a person feeling unmoored. They were 2 people who understood pain, but that didn't necessarily mean they knew how to help each other heal. Their relationship had its tender moments, times when they seemed genuinely connected, but it also had tension that occasionally surfaced in ways that concerned those around them. Money was tight, tighter than either of them liked to admit. David's disability payments covered basics, but they weren't living comfortably. Sarah's social work salary helped, but it wasn't enough to eliminate the stress that comes with watching every dollar. They'd talked about downsizing, maybe moving somewhere cheaper, but those conversations never seemed to go anywhere concrete. There were other stressors too, the kind that build up slowly in a marriage until they create a constant low-level friction. David spent a lot of time alone, often going on long runs through the nearby woods, sometimes disappearing for hours at a time. Sarah would occasionally mention to friends that she felt lonely, even when they were in the same house, that they seemed to be living parallel lives rather than a shared one. But she also said she loved him, that despite the challenges, she believed they were working toward something better. That's what made what happened next so impossible to understand. The last day anyone saw Sarah alive was May 25th, the day after her 52nd birthday. They'd celebrated quietly the night before, just the two of them at home. David later said they'd had wine, talked, that it had been a pleasant evening without any arguments or unusual tension. He claimed they went to bed around 10:30, nothing out of the ordinary, just another night in their established routine. But when he woke up the next morning, Sarah was gone. Not just out of bed, but completely absent from the house. Her car sat in the driveway. Her purse with her wallet and identification remained on the kitchen counter. Her phone lay charging on the nightstand. Her medications, the ones she took every single day without fail, were still in the bathroom cabinet. Everything that would allow a person to function in the world, to move through it with intention and purpose, was still there. Only Sarah wasn't. David said he initially wasn't worried. He assumed she'd gone for an early morning walk, something she did occasionally when she couldn't sleep. But as the morning stretched into afternoon with no sign of her, no call, no text, his concern grew. He searched the neighborhood, drove the nearby streets, checked with neighbors who hadn't seen her. By early evening, he called the police to report her missing. The responding officers took the report seriously from the start. A woman with a history of depression disappearing without any of her belongings raised immediate red flags. They began a search that very night, focusing on the wooded areas near the couple's home, knowing that people in crisis often seek isolation in natural spaces. The search expanded over the following days, involving K9 units, drone surveillance, volunteers combing through acres of dense forest. They found nothing. The investigation into Sarah's disappearance quickly became complicated by questions about her mental state and her marriage. Detectives interviewed David extensively, and while he was cooperative, some officers noted that his demeanor seemed oddly flat for someone whose wife had vanished. He answered questions carefully, precisely, but without the emotional volatility they typically saw from worried spouses. He maintained that their relationship was fine, that Sarah had been stable, that he had no idea where she might have gone or why. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered details that painted a more complicated picture. Neighbors reported hearing occasional arguments from the house, nothing violent but heated enough to be audible through walls. Sarah's therapist, bound by confidentiality but able to confirm certain facts after her disappearance, indicated that Sarah had expressed feelings of isolation within her marriage, though nothing that suggested immediate danger. There were financial records showing the couple's mounting debts, credit cards approaching their limits, a second mortgage taken out on their house. None of this proved anything, but it created a context that made the disappearance feel less straightforward than a simple walk in the woods. 4 months passed. 4 months of Sarah's family living in agonizing limbo, not knowing if she was alive somewhere, suffering from a mental health crisis, or if something far worse had happened. 4 months of search teams returning empty-handed, of police following leads that went nowhere, of media coverage that gradually faded as the story grew cold. David continued living in their house, maintaining his routines, occasionally giving statements to local news outlets pleading for any information about Sarah's whereabouts. Some people felt sympathy for him, a man whose wife had apparently vanished into thin air. Others grew increasingly suspicious, pointing to statistics showing that when a woman disappears, the person responsible is most often someone close to her. But suspicion without evidence is just speculation, and the case seemed destined to remain one of those terrible mysteries that never gets resolved. Then, on September 15th, everything changed. 3 women were foraging for wild mushrooms in a wooded area about half a mile from where Sarah and David lived, a section of forest that had been searched multiple times in the months after her disappearance. They came across what they first thought was a mannequin. Something about the position and the stillness made it seem artificial. But as they got closer, the horrible reality became clear. They'd found human remains, skeletal, partially clothed, in a kneeling position against a tree. There was a USB charging cable wrapped around the neck area, secured to a low branch. At the base of the tree, arranged with an almost ceremonial precision, were 2 rings, a wedding band and an engagement ring that Sarah's family would later confirm were hers. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation and the community. Here was Sarah, or what remained of her, in an area that multiple trained search teams had supposedly covered thoroughly. How had they missed her for 4 months? That question alone raised serious concerns about the competency of the initial search efforts, but even more troubling were the questions raised by the condition and position of the remains. The medical examiner's initial assessment struggled to determine a cause of death. The body was significantly decomposed, skeletonized in some areas, which made determining what had happened extremely difficult. There were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones themselves, no fractures or marks that would indicate violence, but the USB cable around the neck and the position of the body immediately suggested either suicide or staged suicide. The problem was figuring out which. This is where the case split into 2 competing narratives that would eventually tear the community apart and lead to one of the most controversial trials in recent Ohio history. The first narrative, the one that some investigators initially leaned toward, was that Sarah had taken her own life. She had a documented history of depression. She'd been found in a secluded area of woods where someone seeking privacy and finality might go. The cable around her neck and secured to the tree suggested a method of self-harm. Her rings placed at the base of the tree could be interpreted as a final symbolic gesture, a removal of the ties that bound her to a life she no longer wanted to live. In this version of events, the tragedy was simple and heartbreaking. A woman in crisis making an irreversible decision, and a search effort that failed to find her until it was far too late. But the second narrative, the one that would eventually lead to criminal charges, suggested something far darker. This version questioned almost everything about the scene. How does someone hang themselves in a kneeling position with a USB cable attached to a branch that low? The mechanics seemed wrong to investigators who'd seen actual suicide scenes. Why would someone remove their rings and place them carefully at the base of the tree before dying? That kind of deliberate staging suggested someone else's involvement, someone trying to create a scene that looked like suicide, but getting the details subtly wrong. And then there were the questions about David's behavior in the months after Sarah's disappearance, the way he'd seemed more resigned than desperate, more focused on controlling the narrative than frantically searching for answers. Add to this some troubling timeline inconsistencies in David's account of that last night. Phone records that didn't quite match his version of events, and a few statements he'd made to friends that seemed oddly detached, and a picture began to emerge of a husband who might know more than he was saying. The investigation intensified, now focused specifically on David Moore as a potential suspect. Detectives re-interviewed everyone who knew the couple, looking for any evidence of escalating conflict or violence. They brought in forensic experts to examine the remains and the scene more carefully. They built a timeline of David's movements on the day Sarah disappeared and in the days immediately following. They analyzed his phone, his computer, his financial records, looking for anything that might indicate planning or consciousness of guilt. What they found wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to convince prosecutors that they could make a case. 6 months after Sarah's remains were discovered, David Moore was arrested and charged with murder. The prosecution's theory was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. They argued that David had killed Sarah in their home, most likely by strangulation, during or after an argument on the night of May 25th. They suggested that he'd then transported her body to the woods under cover of darkness, staged the scene to look like a suicide, and returned home to begin the performance of being a concerned husband whose wife had inexplicably vanished. Their case rested on several key pillars. First, the forensic evidence, particularly the opinion of their medical examiner, who concluded that the fractures found in Sarah's neck bones were consistent with manual strangulation rather than hanging. Second, the implausibility of the suicide staging, the kneeling position, the low branch, the placed rings, details that they argued no one taking their own life would think to include. Third, David's behavior and statements. the lack of emotional affect, the inconsistencies in his timeline, statements to friends suggesting marital discord he later downplayed. And fourth, the absence of any evidence that Sarah had left the house under her own power that morning. No sightings, no phone activity, no logical explanation for where she would have gone or why. The defense mounted an equally vigorous counter-argument that exposed significant weaknesses in the prosecution's case. They brought in their own forensic expert, who examined the same evidence and reached a completely different conclusion, arguing that the neck fractures were entirely consistent with hanging, and that manual strangulation would have left different, more extensive damage. They pointed out that the prosecution's expert had never actually examined Sarah's body in person, had only reviewed photographs and reports, raising serious questions about the reliability of that testimony. They challenged the assertion that the scene staging was implausible, bringing in mental health experts who testified that people in severe depressive episodes can engage in ritualistic behaviors before taking their own lives, that the placement of rings could represent a symbolic severing of earthly attachments. They highlighted Sarah's documented history of depression and suicidal ideation, medical records showing she'd had thoughts of self-harm in the past, even if she'd never acted on them. But perhaps most damaging to the prosecution's case was the defense's systematic dismantling of the investigation itself. They showed how search teams had indeed covered the area where Sarah was found, multiple times, raising the question of whether her body had actually been there all along, or if it had been placed there later. They demonstrated that the crime scene had been contaminated and poorly documented, with crucial photographs missing and evidence handling protocols violated. They presented alternative timelines that were just as consistent with the evidence as the prosecution's version, scenarios in which Sarah could have left the house early that morning and taken her own life without David's knowledge or involvement. They portrayed David not as a calculated killer but as a grieving husband being railroaded by investigators who were embarrassed by their own failures and needed someone to blame. The trial lasted 3 weeks and became a media spectacle, with every day's testimony analyzed and debated on local news and true crime forums. The prosecution presented witness after witness, building their circumstantial case, piece by careful piece. The defense dismantled each element, showing reasonable doubt at every turn. Sarah's family sat in the courtroom every single day, desperate for answers, for justice, for some way to make sense of their loss. Some of them believed David was responsible and needed to be held accountable. Others weren't sure what to believe anymore. The competing narratives had created such confusion that certainty felt impossible. The jury deliberated for 4 days, an agonizing stretch during which everyone connected to the case existed in suspended animation, waiting for a verdict that would define how Sarah's story would be remembered. When the jury returned, the courtroom was silent. The foreperson stood and delivered the verdict that would shock almost everyone who'd followed the case closely. Not guilty. David Moore was acquitted of all charges. The decision hit Sarah's family like a physical blow, some of them openly weeping, others sitting in stunned silence. David himself broke down, tears streaming down his face. Whether from relief or the weight of everything he'd endured or something else entirely, no one could say for certain. The prosecution was blindsided. They'd believed they had enough to secure a conviction, and the acquittal felt like a repudiation of months of careful work. But the jury had spoken, and in the American justice system, their word was final. In the aftermath of the trial, the divisions only deepened. The medical examiner's office refused to change Sarah's death certificate, which still lists her manner of death as homicide, an extraordinary position to maintain after an acquittal. The police department stood by their investigation, with several detectives giving interviews, expressing their continued belief that David was responsible and that the jury had simply gotten it wrong. Sarah's family remained split, some certain of David's guilt, others accepting the verdict as the closest thing to truth they were likely to get. David himself struggled to rebuild any semblance of a normal life, the stigma of having been accused of murdering his wife clinging to him even after his acquittal. He eventually wrote a book about his experience, maintaining his innocence and describing the nightmare of being wrongly accused, but the book only reignited debates rather than settling them. The case continues to haunt everyone it touched, because there are no satisfying answers, only competing interpretations of ambiguous evidence. If David killed Sarah, he got away with it. A thought that torments her family and the investigators who worked so hard to prove his guilt. If David is innocent, then Sarah died alone in those woods, consumed by a depression that ultimately proved fatal, and her husband was then put through a hellish ordeal of suspicion and prosecution for a crime that never occurred. Both possibilities are awful in different ways, and the evidence genuinely supports both narratives, depending on how you weigh each piece and what assumptions you bring to your interpretation. This is the reality of many criminal cases. They're not like television shows where everything resolves neatly in the final act. They're messy, complicated, filtered through imperfect investigations and fallible witnesses and forensic science that's more uncertain than most people realize. What we're left with are questions that may never be fully answered. Was justice truly served? Did the jury reach the right conclusion based on reasonable doubt? Or did a guilty man walk free because the prosecution couldn't quite prove what they knew in their hearts to be true? And what about Sarah herself? Does she get lost in all these debates about guilt and innocence, reduced to evidence in competing theories, rather than remembered as a full human being who lived and loved and suffered? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They matter profoundly to everyone who knew Sarah, to her family who will never get her back regardless of how she died, to a community that's been forced to confront how little certainty is actually possible, even when you want it desperately. The truth, whatever it is, remains somewhere in that gap between what we can prove and what we can know, between the story the evidence tells and the story we need it to make sense of senseless loss. I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think really happened that night? And if you want more real-life mysteries that challenge everything you think you know, make sure you're subscribed, because the next case is even stranger.